I'll never forget the afternoon Tom swaggered into the den, a beer in one hand, his golf buddies trailing behind, and crowed, "Linda's lawn is the envy of the damn county. Lush as Augusta. All her own doing." I froze mid-chop in the kitchen, the knife hovering over his precious onions, his words dripping like sweat down my spine. He didn't know, couldn't know, that the grass he worshipped wasn't mine to claim, that it thrived under another man's hands, hands that had lingered too long on more than just the mower. That was the hook that snared me, the thrill of his blind pride, the secret I buried beneath perfect roses, blooming with a betrayal he'd never suspect. It wasn't always like that. For 28 years, I'd been the dutiful wife, ironing Tom's shirts, hosting his poker nights, nodding along when he rambled about sales quotas. Our house in suburban Ohio was a postcard, white picket fence, two-car garage, a lawn so lush it practically begged for a magazine spread. I took pride in it once, back when Tom would still kiss me goodnight, instead of collapsing into snores. But somewhere along the line he stopped seeing me. I became wallpaper, pretty familiar, ignored. The lawn was all he noticed, and even then, he thought it was my doing. Last April changed everything. Tom was gone more than ever. Regional meetings, client dinners, a life that didn't include me. I'd wake up to an empty bed, brew my coffee, and wander outside to tend the yard. It was my therapy, keeping the chaos at bay. That's when I first saw Jim, the widower from 2 houses down. He was pushing an old mower across his patchy grass, his graying hair sticking to his forehead, a faded flannel rolled up to his elbows. He wasn't handsome, not like Tom was in our early days, but there was something alive in him, something steady. He caught me staring and waved. "Morning, Linda. Your lawn's a masterpiece. What's your trick?" I laughed it off. "Water and stubbornness, Jim." But he kept coming back. A nod turned into a chat turned into him offering to trim my hedges one muggy afternoon. "Can't let a lady wrestle with those clippers," he said, grinning like he'd just won a prize. I didn't need the help. I'd managed fine on my own, but I said yes anyway. Soon he was over every weekend, raking leaves, spreading mulch, watering the roses while I watched from the porch. I'd bring him lemonade, and we'd sit there, the sun dipping low, talking about nothing important, old TV shows, the best way to grill a steak, how his wife used to love daisies before she passed. Tom never blinked. He'd roll in after dark, wave at Jim like he was just some retiree doing a neighborly favor, and head inside to flip on the game. "Good to see you keeping the place up, hon," he'd mutter, not even looking at me. I'd nod, my hands still tingling from where Jim's fingers brushed mine when I handed him the glass. It wasn't supposed to mean anything. I told myself that 100 times. I was 52, not some starry-eyed girl chasing trouble. But Jim's voice, gravelly, warm, stuck with me. His compliments weren't just about the yard. "You've got a way of making things bloom, Linda," he said one day, his eyes locking on mine a beat too long. My chest tightened, and I laughed it away, but the seed was planted. By June, I stopped pretending it was just about the lawn. Jim wasn't just helping with the grass. He was filling a space Tom had left empty. And when Tom came home one night, kicking off his shoes and boasting, "Linda's lawn could win awards," I didn't correct him. I poured myself a glass of wine, stared out at the yard Jim had tended, and wondered why my heart was racing, and why I didn't want it to stop. Here's part 2 of the story, written to be approximately 6,000 characters long, maintaining the emotional depth, plot twists, and engaging tone to keep the target audience, American men aged 50+, hooked with a 70 to 80% retention rate. The narrative continues in Linda's first-person perspective, building on the foundation from part 1 with a focus on escalating tension and subtle, veiled implications. Part 2. The Line I Didn't See. Character count, 6,000. Summer rolled in heavy that year, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer over the asphalt. My lawn stayed flawless, thanks to Jim, and Tom kept singing my praises to anyone who'd listen. "Linda's a wizard with that yard," he'd say at the 4th of July cookout, flipping burgers while neighbors nodded. I'd smile, flipping potato salad with a spoon, feeling the weight of eyes on me. Tom's pride, their envy, and Jim's quiet gaze from across the picnic table. He didn't say much that day, just sipped his beer and watched me like he knew something I didn't. I told myself it was nothing, but my pulse said otherwise. The truth is, I didn't see the line until I'd already crossed it. Jim's visits weren't just about the lawn anymore. He'd show up with a thermos of coffee on cool mornings, or a tattered paperback he thought I'd like. "You seem like a mystery fan, Linda," he'd tease, handing me some dog-eared Agatha Christie. We'd sit on my porch swing, the creak of it matching the rhythm of our voices, talking about things Tom and I hadn't touched in years, dreams we'd shelved, places we'd never seen. He'd laugh at my stories about raising our daughter, Katie, now off in Chicago with her own life, and I'd listen to him recount his days fixing cars before he retired. It was easy, too easy, and I started craving it like air. Tom didn't notice the shift. He was too busy with his own world, late nights, expense reports, a promotion he swore was coming. "Big things, hon," he'd say, barely looking up from his phone. I'd stopped waiting for him to ask about my day. Meanwhile, Jim remembered everything. He brought me a daisy one morning. "Reminded me of you," he said, tucking it behind my ear with a grin that made my knees weak. I laughed it off, but I kept that flower in a vase until it wilted, hiding it in the kitchen where Tom wouldn't see. It felt like a secret I wasn't ready to name. Then came the day that tipped the scales. It was late July, the sun blazing, and Jim was kneeling by my rose bushes, sweat beading on his neck. I brought him water, and when he stood to take it, his hand lingered over mine, warm, deliberate, not an accident. "You're something special, Linda," he said, his voice low, like a confession. My breath caught, and for a second, I didn't pull away. The world shrank to just us, cicadas buzzing, the glass cold against my palm, his eyes searching mine. I stepped back, stammering about the heat, but the damage was done. That night, I lay awake next to Tom snoring, replaying it, wondering why I hadn't stopped him, and why I didn't want to. The next week, Tom left for a conference in Cincinnati. 3 days, he said. I nodded, packed him a sandwich, waved as he drove off. An hour later, Jim knocked on my door, holding a bag of mulch and a shy smile. "Thought I'd spruce up the flower beds while he's gone," he said. I let him into the yard, into the house, into a space I'd kept locked for years. We worked side by side, then sat with iced tea, the silence thick with something new. When he reached for my hand again, I didn't pull away. It wasn't about the lawn anymore, and we both knew it. Tom called that night, his voice crackling through the line. "How's my green thumb, girl?" I lied through my teeth, said everything was fine, and hung up feeling like a stranger in my own skin. I didn't answer Jim's call that night. The phone glowed on the nightstand, his name a silent shout in the dark, while Tom's snores filled the room like a wall between us. I stared at it until the screen went black, my fingers itching to reach out, my stomach churning with something I couldn't name. Fear, longing, shame, all tangled up. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was a fluke, a line I wouldn't cross again. But lies are funny that way. They grow roots when you're not looking. Tom was home for good now, or so he said. The deal had gone through, and he strutted around like a rooster, talking about a bonus, maybe a new car. "You deserve it, hon," he said, patting my hand over breakfast. "Keeping this place perfect while I'm gone." I forced a smile, the coffee bitter on my tongue. The lawn gleamed outside, mocking me with its beauty, Jim's beauty, not mine. I wanted to tell Tom then, spill it all over the scrambled eggs, but his pride stopped me. He loved me through that lawn, even if he didn't see me anymore. Jim didn't stop coming. He'd wave from his yard, casual as ever, or drop by with some excuse, a spare tomato from his garden, a question about mulch. Tom would chat with him, oblivious, while I hovered in the background, my heart pounding like a drum. "Good guy, that Jim," Tom said one day, tossing his keys on the counter. "Helps you out, huh?" I nodded, my throat tight. "Yeah, he's helpful." The irony stung, but Tom didn't catch it. He never did. Then came the twist I didn't see coming. It was a Saturday, the air crisp with early fall, and Jim showed up with a photo album. Old, leather-bound, edges worn. "Found this cleaning out the attic," he said, setting it on my kitchen table. "Thought you'd like a look." Tom was at the hardware store, so I poured us coffee, and we flipped through it. Pictures of Jim's life before, his wife, his kids, a younger him grinning by that same Chevy he'd rebuilt. I laughed at his bad haircut, and he teased me about my taste in mugs. Then he turned the page, and there it was, a Polaroid of me and Tom, 20 years back, at a block party. I was in a sundress, Tom's arm around me, both of us beaming. Jim tapped it. "You two or something else," he said, his voice soft. I froze. You knew us then?" He nodded. "Moved here right after that. Watched you build this life." My chest tightened. He'd been there all along, a shadow I'd never noticed, and now he was here, unraveling it. "Why didn't you say?" I asked, my voice small. He shrugged, eyes on the photo. "Didn't think it mattered till now." The room spun. He wasn't just a neighbor anymore. He was a witness to what I'd lost with Tom, what I was throwing away. When he touched my hand, I pulled back this time, the photo burning in my mind. Tom came home an hour later, hardware bags in tow, and found us still at the table. "What's this?" he asked, peering at the album. Jim smiled, smooth as ever. "Just showing Linda some history. Your lawn's always been the star, Tom." Tom laughed, proud again, and I wanted to disappear. That night, I hid the daisy Jim had given me in a drawer, its petals crumbling, and stared at the ceiling. The lie wasn't just about the lawn anymore, it was about me, and I didn't know how to stop it from spreading. Here's part 5, written to be approximately 5,500 characters, continuing the story with a strong hook, emotional escalation, and a cliffhanger to ensure 70 to 80% retention for American men aged 50+. The narrative remains in Linda's first-person perspective, pushing her closer to regret while setting up a clear path for a 6th part, all within the 30,000 character total goal. No explicit content or violence is included, per your guidelines. Part 5. The Weight of the Mirror. Character count, 500. I caught myself in the bathroom mirror that October morning, and I didn't like what I saw. My eyes were tired, my mouth a tight line, the woman staring back a stranger wearing my skin. Tom was downstairs, humming over his coffee, planning a fishing trip with his buddies. The lawn outside glowed golden in the fall light, Jim's handiwork, not mine, and I wondered how long I could keep pretending. The photo from Jim's album haunted me, that younger me with Tom, happy and whole. What had I done to her? Jim didn't let up. He'd linger by the mailbox, catch me on my walks, his voice low and steady. "Missed you yesterday, Linda," he'd say, like it was normal, like we hadn't crossed into something dangerous. I'd mumble excuses, laundry, errands, but my feet kept slowing, my resolve cracking. One afternoon, he handed me a scarf he'd found at a thrift shop. "Matches your eyes," he said, brushing my arm as he draped it over my shoulders. I wore it home, the soft wool a secret against my neck, and hid it in the closet before Tom could ask. Each gift, each look, pulled me deeper, and I let it happen. Tom started to notice something, though not what I feared. "You seem distracted, hon," he said one night, flipping through channels. "Everything okay?" I nodded, too quick, and changed the subject, his trip, the weather, anything but me. He bought it, or maybe he didn't care enough to dig. But the next day, he came home early, catching Jim raking leaves in our yard. "Hey, neighbor." Tom called, all grins. "Don't have to do that. Linda's got it covered." Jim chuckled, leaning on the rake. "Just keeping it tidy for her." Their laughter echoed, and I stood at the window, my chest tight. They were so close, so blind, and I was the wedge between them. That night, I cooked Tom's favorite, pot roast, mashed potatoes, the works. I needed to feel like his wife again, not this shadow I'd become. He ate heartily, praising every bite, and for a moment, it was like old times. "You're too good to me, Lynn," he said, squeezing my hand. I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. After he went to bed, I sat in the dark, the scarf in my lap, Jim's voice in my head. I'd let it go too far to call it kindness, too far to blame the lawn. I wanted to end it, tell Jim we were done, but my hands wouldn't move to dial his number. Then the doorbell rang. It was late, past 10, and Tom was asleep. I crept downstairs, heart hammering, and peeked through the curtain. Jim stood there, hands in his pockets, his face lit by the porch light. "Linda," he said through the glass, soft but firm. "We need to talk." My breath hitched. I could send him away, lock the door, pretend this never happened. Or I could open it, step into whatever this was, and let the lie swallow me whole. The knob was cold in my hand, and as I turned it, I knew I was choosing something I couldn't take back. The door creaked open, and there Jim stood, his shadow stretching across my porch like a question I couldn't answer. The night air slipped in, cool and sharp, cutting through the warmth of the house I'd built with Tom over 28 years. "Linda," Jim said again, his voice low, steady, the way it always was, like he belonged here, like he'd earned the right. I should have shut the door, told him to leave, but my hand stayed on the knob, trembling, and my mouth stayed silent. He stepped closer, just over the threshold, and I let him. That was the moment I knew I'd lost something, maybe everything. "Couldn't sleep," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, his eyes searching mine. "Kept thinking about you, about us." Us. The word hit like a stone through glass, shattering the flimsy wall I'd built around what this was. I wanted to laugh, to cry, to tell him there was no us. Just a lawn, a lie, a lonely woman grasping at shadows. But I didn't. I stepped back, letting him in, and closed the door behind him, the click loud in the stillness. Tom was upstairs, snoring through his dreams, oblivious to the stranger standing in his kitchen, the stranger I'd invited. We didn't sit. We stood there, the counter between us, the hum of the fridge filling the silence. "I don't know what I'm doing," I finally said, my voice barely a whisper. "This, whatever it is, it's not me." Jim tilted his head, his face softening. "It's not about the lawn anymore, Linda. You know that. It's about feeling alive again." His words landed like a punch I didn't dodge. Alive. Was that what this was? The flutter in my chest when he smiled, the way my days lit up when he knocked. I'd been sleepwalking through my marriage, and Jim had woken me up. But at what cost? He reached across the counter, his hand finding mine, warm and rough from years of work. "I see you," he said, quieter now. "Not just the yard, not just Tom's wife, you. And I think you see me too." My throat closed up. I did see him, his quiet strength, his loneliness mirroring mine, the way he filled a space Tom had left empty. But seeing him meant betraying Tom, betraying the woman I'd promised to be. I pulled my hand back, wrapping my arms around myself like a shield. "Tom's upstairs," I said, sharper than I meant. "This isn't right." Jim didn't flinch. "Maybe not, but it's real." He stepped around the counter, closing the gap, and I didn't move. He didn't touch me again, just stood there, close enough that I could smell the faint cedar of his jacket, feel the heat of him. "Tell me to go," he said, his voice a challenge. "Tell me you don't feel it and I'll walk away." I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. My mind screamed at me to end it, send him out, lock the door, crawl back to Tom and beg forgiveness from a God I hadn't prayed to in years. But my heart, that traitor, kept me rooted, silent, staring into eyes that saw too much. Minutes stretched into forever. Then the stairs creaked. My breath stopped, and Jim's head snapped toward the sound. Tom's voice floated down, groggy, half asleep. "Lynn, you okay down there?" Panic clawed my chest. I shoved Jim toward the back door, my hands shaking. "Go," I hissed, shoving harder when he hesitated. He slipped out just as Tom's slippers shuffled into the kitchen. "Thought I heard something," he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. I forced a smile, my pulse hammering. Just getting water. Go back to bed. He nodded, shuffled off, and I sank against the counter, the scarf still tangled in my fingers from where I'd grabbed it in the chaos. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark, replaying Jim's words, Tom's trust, the life I was unraveling. The lawn glowed under the moon outside, perfect and accusing. I'd opened the door to Jim, to this, and now I couldn't close it, not without breaking something. But what? My marriage? My heart? Myself? The answer was coming, whether I wanted it or not. Morning broke cold and gray, the kind of light that makes everything look tired. I stood at the kitchen window, coffee gone cold in my hands, staring at the lawn. Jim's lawn. Not mine, never mine. Tom shuffled in behind me, his slippers scuffing the floor, and kissed the top of my head. Gonna miss this place when I'm fishing, he said, oblivious as ever. He'd be gone all weekend, leaving me alone with the mess I'd made. I nodded, murmured something about packing his cooler, and watched him lumber off, humming like the world hadn't shifted under his feet. But it had because of me. Jim didn't come by that day. I'd half expected him to, braced for his knock, his steady voice pulling me back into the whirlpool. When he didn't, I felt relieved and hollow. I wandered the house, touching things that used to mean something. The photo of Tom and me at Katie's graduation, the quilt we'd bought on our honeymoon, the life we'd stitched together. It all felt like a museum now, relics of a woman I didn't recognize. I pulled the scarf from the closet, ran my fingers over its threads, and smelled cedar faintly clinging to it. Jim's scent, Jim's mark. I should have burned it. Instead, I clutched it tighter. By noon, I couldn't stand the silence. I walked to his house, 2 doors down, the scarf in my pocket like a guilty heartbeat. He answered on the second knock, his face softening when he saw me. Linda, he said, stepping aside. I didn't go in. We need to stop, I said, the words scraping my throat raw. This, whatever it is, it's over. He didn't argue, just leaned against the doorframe, his eyes tracing me like he was memorizing something he'd lose. If that's what you want, he said finally. But you came here, not me. The truth stung. I had come. I'd chosen this, every step, and now I was choking on it. I turned away, tears blurring the street, and walked home. The lawn greeted me, pristine and cruel, a mirror of my failure. I sank onto the porch swing, the creak of it a rhythm to my unraveling. That's when it hit me, Tom's trust, his pride, the way he'd bragged about my lawn to anyone who'd listen. He'd never questioned me, never doubted, and I'd repaid him with secrets, with Jim's hands on mine, with a betrayal that didn't need words to cut deep. I wasn't the wife he deserved anymore. Maybe I never had been. Saturday dragged on, and I cleaned, scrubbed counters, dusted shelves, trying to erase the stain of myself. But Sunday morning, Tom called from the lake. Caught a big one, Lynn, he said, his voice crackling with joy. Can't wait to tell the guys how you keep everything perfect back home. I choked out a laugh, tears spilling, and hung up before he heard me break. I stumbled outside, grabbed the clippers, and attacked the hedges. Wild, desperate, like I could cut away the last 6 months. Thorns bit my hands, but I didn't stop. The lawn mocked me, its perfection a lie I couldn't live up to. Jim watched from his yard. I saw him through the blur of my tears, standing there with his rake, quiet, still. He didn't wave, didn't call out, just watched me fall apart. I dropped the clippers, sank to my knees in the grass, and sobbed. Not for him, not for Tom, but for me, the woman who'd wanted to feel alive and ended up dead inside. The lawn stretched around me, green and endless, tended by hands that weren't mine, loved by a man who didn't know the truth. I'd ruined it, all of it, and there was no fixing this. When Tom came home Sunday night, he found me on the couch, the scarf in a heap on the coffee table. What's this? He asked, picking it up. Got it at a thrift shop. I lied, my voice flat. He shrugged, tossed it aside. and went on about his fish. I stared at the lawn through the window, its beauty a weight I'd carry forever. Jim wouldn't come back. I'd made sure of that, but the regret would. It settled in my bones, cold and heavy, a harvest I'd sown with every glance, every touch, every choice. Tom hugged me goodnight, proud as ever, and I let him. But I didn't deserve it, not anymore. Tom's hug that Sunday night lingered on me like a ghost, warm and heavy, a reminder of everything I'd broken. He went to bed, his snores drifting down the hall, while I sat frozen on the couch, the scarf crumpled beside me. The lawn glowed under the streetlight outside, its edges sharp, its green unrelenting, Jim's masterpiece, Tom's pride, my shame. I'd told Jim it was over, but the words felt like ash in my mouth, burned out and useless. Ending it didn't erase what I'd done. It just left me alone with it, a hollowed-out shell staring at a life I didn't fit into anymore. Monday dawned too bright, the kind of day that should have felt hopeful. Tom whistled through his morning routine, packing his briefcase for the office, chatting about his fish like it was the highlight of our year. "You should have seen it, Lynn," he said, grinning over his toast. "Biggest face yet." I nodded, stirred my coffee, tried to mirror his smile. He didn't see the cracks, never had. "Keep that lawn looking good while I'm gone," he added, kissing my cheek before he left. The door clicked shut, and the silence roared in, louder than Jim's mower ever was. I couldn't stay inside. The walls pressed too close, every picture and knick-knack accusing me of the wife I'd stopped being. I grabbed my coat and walked, past Jim's house, past the perfect lawns of our neighbors, past the life I'd pretended to tend. The scarf stayed in my pocket, a weight I couldn't shed. I ended up at the park, the one where Tom and I used to push Katie on the swings, back when love was simple and I knew who I was. The benches were empty now, the leaves crunching under my feet, and I sat there, watching the wind chase itself through the trees. That's when I saw her, Mrs. Carter, the nosy widow from across the street. She shuffled over, her cane tapping, her eyes sharp as ever. "Linda," she said, settling beside me. "You've been quiet lately. Everything all right?" I forced a laugh, waved it off. "Just busy." She hummed, unconvinced. "That Jim's been around a lot. Helping with the yard, I suppose." My stomach dropped. "He's a good neighbor," I said, too quick. She nodded, her gaze lingering. "Folks notice things, dear. Small towns talk." She patted my knee and left, her words a splinter I couldn't pull out. Panic clawed at me all the way home. Had she seen more than she let on? Had others? I'd been so careful, or thought I had. The lemonade on the porch, the late-night talks, Jim's truck parked just out of sight. Had it all been a spotlight I didn't notice? I paced the kitchen, replaying every moment, every glance, every time I'd let Jim's hand linger. Tom's trust had blinded him, but the neighbors weren't Tom. If they knew, if they whispered, it'd reach him eventually. And then what? I'd lose everything. Not just the lie, but the man who'd loved me through it. I avoided the yard all day, stayed inside with the curtains drawn, like I could hide from the truth. But dusk brought a knock, soft, hesitant. My heart sank. I peeked through the window and saw Jim, his hands stuffed in his jacket, his face drawn. "Linda," he called, muffled through the glass. "I know you're there." I didn't move, didn't breathe. He knocked again. "I'm not here to push. Just, I need to say something." My resolve frayed. Against every shred of sense, I opened the door, just a crack. "What?" I snapped, sharper than I meant. He looked tired, older than I'd ever seen him. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "For all of it. I shouldn't have let it get this far." The apology hit harder than his confessions ever had. I wanted to yell, to blame him, but the mirror was too clear. I'd let it happen too. "It's done," I said, my throat tight. "Go home, Jim." He nodded, lingered a moment, then turned away. I shut the door, slid to the floor, and cried. Ugly, wrenching sobs that shook me apart. Mrs. Carter's warning, Jim's regret, Tom's blind faith, they swirled in my head, a storm I couldn't outrun. And somewhere upstairs, the phone rang, Tom's name on the screen, waiting for me to pick up. The phone kept ringing, Tom's name flashing like a lifeline I didn't deserve. I sat there on the kitchen floor, Jim's apology still ringing in my ears, Mrs. Carter's words coiling tighter around my chest. My hands shook as I reached for it, the scarf slipping from my pocket onto the tile, a soft, accusing heap. I answered on the last ring, my voice a rasp. "Hey, hon," Tom said, cheerful as ever. "Just checking in. You okay?" I swallowed the lump in my throat, lied through my teeth.
"Fine.
"How's work?" He rambled about clients, oblivious, and I clung to his voice, a tether to the life I'd nearly thrown away. But it wasn't enough. When I hung up, the house pressed in again, every corner whispering what I'd done. I stumbled upstairs, past the bedroom where Tom's fishing gear lay scattered, and into the bathroom. The mirror showed me again, pale, hollow, a woman drowning in her own choices. I'd told Jim it was over, but the damage was done, carved into me like initials on a tree. I splashed water on my face, tried to wash it away, but the cold only sharpened the ache. Downstairs, the scarf waited, and I knew I couldn't keep it, not anymore. I grabbed it and marched outside, the night air biting my skin. The lawn stretched before me, flawless under the moon, a monument to my betrayal. I'd let Jim tend it, let him tend me, while Tom praised a lie I'd fed him. My knees buckled, and I sank into the grass, the scarf clenched in my fists. I wanted to rip it apart, rip myself apart, but all I could do was cry. Quiet, broken sobs that soaked into the earth. The neighbors might see, might talk, but I didn't care.
Let them.
Let it all come crashing down. I deserved it. Tuesday morning, I called in sick to the library where I volunteered, couldn't face the world. Tom texted, "Home late tonight, love you," and I stared at it, the words a knife. Love you. Did he?
Did I?
I wandered the yard, clippers in hand, but didn't cut a thing. The roses drooped, the hedges bristled, and I let them. For once, I wouldn't pretend. Jim stayed away, his truck gone from the street, his silence a mercy I didn't earn. I avoided the windows, avoided his house, avoided myself in every reflection. By Wednesday, the crack showed. Tom came home, dropped his bag, and squinted outside. "Lawn's looking a little rough, hon," he said, not accusing, just puzzled. "You feeling okay?" I nodded, mumbled about a busy week, but he lingered, watching me. "You sure?" he pressed, softer this time. I wanted to collapse into him, confess everything. The lemonade, the talks, the hands that weren't his, but I couldn't. "I'm fine." I lied again, and he let it go, trusting me like always. That trust was the worst part, heavier than Jim's gaze ever was. Days blurred into weeks. I stopped tending the yard, let the weeds creep in, the edges fray. Tom noticed, tried to help, mowed it once, trimmed the bushes, but I told him to leave it. "It's just grass," I said, sharper than I meant. He frowned, confused, but didn't push. The neighbors whispered. I caught their glances, heard Mrs. Carter's cane tapping past, but no one said a word to Tom. Not yet. Jim moved away that November, a for sale sign stabbing the ground where his truck used to park. I didn't say goodbye. I couldn't. Winter came, blanketing the lawn in snow, hiding its flaws. Tom still bragged about it sometimes, memory filling in what reality didn't. I'd smile, nod, let him believe. But every night, I'd stand at the window, staring at the white expanse and feel it, the regret, cold and endless, rooting deeper than any weed. I'd wanted to feel alive, and I had for a moment. Jim had given me that, and I'd taken it, greedy and blind. Now I was left with this. A husband who didn't know, a yard I couldn't tend, a woman I didn't want to be. The snow fell thicker, burying the green, And I let it. Some things I'd learned you can't grow back.